Hello and welcome to Math200 Statistics here at Kenyatta College. My name is Ray Lapuz. In this video, we will take a quick peek at section 1.2 from our OpenStax textbook, Data, Sampling, and Variations in Data and Sampling. So first, we want to remind ourselves of the types of data that we could collect. We could collect information about people or about a population that is qualitative, which would be categorical, or quantitative, which would be numerical. So qualitative data would be some categorized attribute of a population, like hair color, blood type, etc. So they're generally described with words. And the quantitative data are going to be numerical things that we can put in order, and sometimes the numbers could be whole numbers, or sometimes they can involve numbers that are between whole numbers. And so we can further break down this idea of a quantitative data into the discrete data, which would be like counting numbers, like 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So whole numbers would be what we were talking about. Or if we want to include every number in a number line, we could also be looking at continuous data. So discrete data and continuous data are all examples of quantitative data, numerical. So here's an example. We go to the supermarket and purchase 3 cans of soup, tomato bisque, that's 14.1 ounces of lentil and 19 ounces of Italian wedding, and then 2 packages of nuts, walnuts, peanuts, 4 kinds of vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, spinach, and carrots, and 2 desserts, a 16-ounce Cherry Garcia ice cream and a 2 pounds 32-ounce chocolate chip cookies. So let's try to identify which of these are quantitative discrete, or quantitative continuous, or qualitative data. So based on this information, when we count the 3 kinds of soup and 2 packages of nuts and 4 kinds of vegetables, so we're looking at those as quantities that we count. So because we're able to count them as quantities, we're looking at them as discrete data. Now the weights of each of those are 19 ounces or 14.1. Now 19 ounces is a whole number, but if we're looking at things that we're measuring with weight or height or volume or things like that, we want to be able to acknowledge that it's labeled as 19 ounces, but when you actually pour the contents out and weigh it, it may weigh 18.8 or 19.2 ounces or something that might be on a continuous scale and not necessarily a whole number. So those things can be looked at as quantitative data that is continuous. Now the types of soup that we were identifying, the types of nuts that we were identifying, those are nominal. They have names to them, categorical, so they can be looked at as qualitative data. So here's another example or another set of examples. Let's determine the correct type of data, quantitative or qualitative. And if it is quantitative, let's identify whether they're continuous or discrete. So and they give you a hint here when you're looking at these types of problems. When they say the number of, that usually means you're counting something, so that refers to discrete data. So the first one, the number of pairs of shoes that you own, well, clearly the number of, so that's our hint. We can own 5 pairs of shoes, so that will give you a whole number. So that is discrete. The type of car you drive, if you drive a Honda Pilot, then you're looking at a qualitative data, categorical, the type of car, so that's qualitative. The distance from your home to the grocery store, that is a measurement of, well, distance. You can measure it in miles, feet, depending on meters, how close you are. So that would be a quantitative data that is actually continuous. The number of classes you take, you can't really take a half of a class, so you're taking a whole number of classes. That's quantitative discrete. The type of calculator you use, TI-84, TI-83, so those are qualitative, those are categorical. Weights of sumo wrestlers, a weight again is some sort of measurement that is not necessarily a whole number, so that is quantitative continuous. Number of correct answers on a quiz, that would be quantitative discrete. And your IQ score, so the IQ score usually is given as a whole number, but sometimes we want to put the IQ score in a number line so that we can say, instead of getting a score of 14 or 140 and 141, maybe 141.5. Well, they say in this case it's up for debate and may cause some discussions. But here are the results or the answers. And looking at H here, items C, F, and H are qualitative continuous or quantitative continuous. So they're looking at that as something that goes in a number line. It's definitely quantitative, it's definitely numerical, but the score, if you want to allow scores that are 140.1, then you're looking at it continuous. So now let's talk about, after collecting data, before we start diving into the statistics of things or collecting these statistics, we can first look at displaying them and finding a way to put them in graphs. So tables are a good way to organize the data set, but if you're looking at these numbers and you look at 40%, 40.9%, 51.9%, and that adds up to 100%, looking at those numbers may not give you a quick, clear picture of what's happening. And so if you're comparing these numbers especially, it might be better if we look at it from a graphical point of view. So one way to graph something that is made up of 100% would be a pie chart. So if we take a look at a pie chart, we can see the breakdown between the part-time and full-time. First of all, you can immediately see via a picture that there's more part-timers in De Anza and in Foothill College than there are full-timers. But if you take a look at the graphs without necessarily looking at a number, you can immediately tell that Foothill, the percentage of Foothill part-timers is larger than the percentage of De Anza part-timers. So you can see that clearly with a pie chart. And here they talk about sometimes your pie chart is something that we want to account for that goes up to 100%, but sometimes there's some overlapping in the numbers that you're collecting. And so in those cases, you may want to use a different chart. So the pie chart generally wants these numbers to add up to 100%. Now, if there are some overlap in some data, you can use the Venn diagram, but generally, if you take a look at a bar graph, you can see the comparison and looking at the total number of students. So you can graph this by looking at it out of 100%. So a little bit more about the pie chart. Pie chart is good to explain the comparing the difference between, for example, ethnicities of students. And sometimes if we look at the ethnicities of students by alphabetical order, for example, the pie chart might not seem as clear, and so you have to keep going back to the legend to try to figure out which color is assigned to which ethnicity. But if we change the order of the pie chart so that we're looking at the pie chart by looking at the largest percentage and have it decreasing down and sort it that way, we can see that we might have a better idea of comparing the different ethnicities by looking at the pie chart. And we can see that the Asians have the most in the most percentage in the population. Next are the whites, next are the Hispanics, etc. So looking at the order of the pie chart by the highest percentage to the lowest percentage might be a good way to describe or to organize your pie chart. The same with the bar graph. We can take a look at the bar graph and put it in alphabetical order by the categories, or we can rearrange the bar graph by the percentage in the order of the percentage, and that might be a better read, an easier way to explain your data set instead of alphabetizing the categories. Next, let's talk about sampling. So the idea behind sampling is to get a smaller subset of the population, because getting information of the whole population might be quite difficult. So if we get a sample, then we can do a study on the sample, and provided that your sample is a good sample, we can see that this thing can represent all of the population. So there are various ways to collect your sample, and the way you would collect your sample would really determine the biases. If you can identify the biases based on how you collected your sample, you can further explain in your report, in your study, how you collected the sample and what the biases might be. And so the reader can actually take that and critically think about how they would interpret your reports or your results. So let's take a look at the different types of sampling. There's a simple random sampling. So if you're looking at sampling like first-year students at a particular college, maybe you can just identify first-year students randomly. Now, how can you do this randomly? Well, there's a lot of different ways of doing this randomly, but the idea is that you're not identifying any particular labels, you're not identifying any particular groups, you're just randomly collecting from the population. So here's an example. Somebody wants to form a 4-person group for the pre-calculus class, and the class has 31 students. So to choose a sample size of 3 from other members of the class, Lisa could put 30 names in a hat, shake the hat, close her eyes, pick out 3 names, and then there is your random sample. You can also use technology to create random samples. A calculator, for example, if you have those students in there, you can ask for a set of 3 or 4 students based on some random program in your calculator. You can also use a table. There exist these random number tables where you can just say you'll start at a particular column or row, and then you start counting 3-digit numbers. And here, if you start in the 3rd row and 2nd column, there's 719, and so you just read from left to right 719, and then 662, and then 3 or 738, etc., so that you can start collecting these numbers. You can also collect a bunch of random samples from just a random number generator, where you would collect random numbers. So if you assign a student a particular number, and then you collect these random number generators and generate as many random numbers as you want or need, then you can identify your random sample that way. Another way to collect information or collect a sample would be the idea of a stratified sample. So choosing a stratified sample, what you would do is you would take your population and divide it into different groups, and then take a proportionate amount of numbers in that particular group. So If let's take a look at an example here. Your stratified group could be your college population by department, and then if you choose a proportionate simple random sample from each of the stratum from each department, then you get a stratified random sample. So if you have 5 departments and you want to choose 50, then you can choose 10 from each of those 5 departments using some sort of simple random sampling with the randomized way of collecting information. Another way to collect samples is cluster samples. To choose a cluster samples, you divide the population into groups again, into these clusters, then randomly select from the clusters. So again, if you have departments in your college, then each of them would be a cluster, and then you divide your college faculty by department, and then from each department you would choose information about, or you would choose your sample from each of those clusters. Systematic sampling would be to have some sort of system where you count off a certain number of values, and then you take whatever, in this case they say the nth piece of data from a list of population. And so if you want to do a phone survey, for example, if you look at the phone book and it has 20,000 listings in there and you have to choose 400 names, then you can number each of the entries in the phone book and go down and divide 20,000 by 400. And so it says here that if you count down, every 50th name would be part of your sample. So you go down to 50, and then you take that phone number, and then you go down to 100, you take that phone number, and you go down to 150, take that phone number, until you get to the end of the phone book where you would have obtained 400 numbers. And so that's another way to collect the sample. And here's another example, convenience sampling. So convenience sampling is not so random. It's just what's most convenient and readily available to you as somebody doing the study. So if you're doing a study, for example, of computer software stores, if you work in a computer software store and you want to conduct a marketing study, then you can simply ask the people that come into your store, and because that's most convenient. So clearly that's not the best way to collect a sample, but it certainly is an option. And so doing something like this would probably require you to make sure that you talk about the sample that you collected, so that people will understand how your study is conducted. Now, when you're collecting samples, there's the idea of having a sample with replacement or without replacement. So that means if you're collecting information about some study that you're doing, and you ask a person the questions that you need to ask, and then you ask a different person, and then you seem to be running out of people, so you ask the first person again, then that's sampling with replacement. And so sometimes that might be a way to do that. So here they talk about true sampling is done with replacement, and once a member is picked, then the member goes back into the population and could possibly be chosen again. So for practical reasons, though, most populations, simple random, is done without replacement, so that you don't choose the same person to give the same set of data. So this clearly would work if you have a super large population, the idea of doing with replacement. If you have a room of 30 people, for example, and you're trying to form a group of 4, then clearly doing this with replacement would not work very well. So most of the time when we collect data, we collect it without replacement. But sometimes with such a huge population, it may be done with replacement if you have a large enough data set. So sampling errors and non-sampling errors, this information is really how we would be reporting our statistical study. So when you analyze data, it's important to be aware of the errors or the biases that might come up based on your samples. So for example, if a sample is not large enough, then you would mention that in your study. Factors not related to sampling process can cause non-sampling errors. Defective count a device can cause non-sampling errors. So in reality, samples never going to be exactly representative of the whole population. So there's always going to be some sort of sampling error, and those are the biases that you need to report when you're doing your study. So critical evaluation, so we need to make sure that we evaluate the statistical study we read about and critically and analyze them before accepting the results. So some common problems, I know this is written really small, but we can talk about problems with the samples. Samples might not be representative. Self-selected samples, kind of similar to the whole idea of convenience samples. If you're a Republican wanting to do a study on gun control, then you sample only Republicans, then I don't know if that's generally encompassing your whole population. Sample size issues, if your sample is too small, it's not going to be a true representative for the whole population. Here they talk about some undue influences, like collecting data or asking questions that might influence the particular response. This is especially important when doing studies in social studies or psychological studies. Non-responses or refusal for subjects to participate. So you identify the sample. If they're not participating, then it could give you could lose out on some strong information. The causality, sometimes a relationship between two variables does not mean that one causes the other to occur. They might be related, but it's not a cause and effect relationship, and that's something that we're going to study later on when we weigh in a later chapter when we do linear regression. Self-funded or self-interest study, that's very similar to kind of like self-selected studies. Misleading use of data and confounding. So there's a lot of information here that you want to be careful about when you're reading some sort of statistical study, or when you yourself are writing a statistical study, to make sure that you want to address this for your audiences to be able to critically evaluate. So here are examples of some samples, the studies done to determine the average tuition in San Jose State, and each student of the following samples are asked how much tuition he or she paid in the fall semester. So what type of sampling in this case? So let's take a look at the first one. A sample of 100 undergraduate students are taken by organizing students' names and classifying them freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and then selecting 25 from each. And so what kind of sample is that? So we're grouping them, and then from each group we're looking at a random sample from each group. So I think that would be either stratified or cluster, but I think in this case it would be stratified. Let's take a look at B. A random number generator is used to select each student from the alphabetical listing of the undergraduate students in the fall, starting and then collecting the 50th student until 75 students are found. So that's, again, looking at putting something in order, and then picking the 50th student in the list, and then the next 50th student in the list. So that's a systematic sampling. C, completely random method is used, selecting 75 students. Each undergraduate student in the fall has the same probability of being chosen, so that's your simple random sample. D, the freshmen, sophomore, junior, seniors are numbered 1 through 4 respectively, and a random number generator is used to pick 2 of those years, and then the students each 2 years are sampled. So that's our example of cluster sampling. And then an administrative assistant is asked to stand in front of the library on one Wednesday to ask 100 students, so that you're sitting there and you're just handing out to the people at your convenience. So that would be a convenience sampling example. Okay, the next idea is talking about variation. So variation is going to be present in any data. And here's an example. We have a 16-ounce can of beverage may contain more or less than 16 ounces of liquid. So a study shows that 6 16-ounce cans were measured, and these are the following amounts. So you're not always going to get the exact measurement as what's labeled in the can or whatever it is you're looking at. So they could be a little bit off, but if they hover around 16, then that's not too bad. Here we have a 14.8, which is kind of low, so maybe there could be an issue here. So it says here the measurement amounts of the beverages in a 16-ounce can vary because different people make the measurements or exact amounts. 16 ounces of liquid was not put into the cans. So manufacturers usually run the test to figure out how accurate they are in falling within the 16 ounce. So a study in variation is kind of like a study in quality control, and they want things to be fairly low variance, so that they can say that, you know, this is the number of ounces we have, or this is the amount of salt or sugar that we have, and they stay as consistent as possible. So that's important in some of the studies that we have as well. All right, so that is the end of our section 1.2, and good luck with identifying these different types of sampling and different types of problems, and good luck in the course.